You've reached the Signal Watch, movies, television, comics, and more. I'm your host, Ryan Steens. Join me and our cadre of co-contributors as we examine cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explore the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay tuned. We're gonna try to make this work. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. Now it's recording.
Yeah, that's better.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Steens, and with me today is
Simon Day.
And we are talking about
Theatre of Blood from 1973.
And you consider this to be one of your Canon films?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm probably stretching it a bit, just because I really like the film. But my first memory, one of my first memories, or what my parents told me, was when I was about 5 years old, I got a bit obsessed. I must have watched this, and I got a bit obsessed, and I kept running around the house for a couple of weeks shouting "Poodle Pie," which you got to see it to understand their reference. But and then it's just stuck with me my entire life. I think it's, as I've got older, I've appreciated it more and more. I think it's such a well-written film, and it's got a great kind of like black comic horror, but black comic kind of sense of performance from everybody in it. It's basically Vincent Price is the only American. I think everybody else is like a British cast, but he's great. And when I was at college, I guess like start of the 90s, I actually had this was back before we had a lot of film t-shirts, but I had I actually took a picture of Vincent Price from Theatre of Blood and had it put on a t-shirt.
Oh my god.
And I was very proud of that t-shirt for a couple of years until I wore it out. But it was him actually, it was the old English VHS cover of him crossing out the faces of the other critics. And and it's funny, I guess it is a Canon film because I literally watched this a month ago. I actually finally bought a new Blu-ray with lots of extras, mainly for the extras, to be honest. There's like a commentary from the League of Gentlemen, who are like a British kind of like comedy actor group, who actually did a really good commentary. So watching it today, I don't know, I didn't feel kind of like I was going to be bored today, and I wasn't. I really enjoyed it again, so I guess that's the sign of a really good film.
So I've only seen this the one time. I think we were trying to figure out how long ago that was. I said 5 years, you said 2, and I was like, well, time hasn't had any meaning for some time.
Let's compromise on 3.
Yeah.
3.5.
And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it the first time, and I think I enjoyed it even more the second time, kind of, because you're not just trying to take in everything that's happening. You kind of know what the drill is and how things are going to wrap up, so then you're looking at how things are done.
And there's so many references that I feel like even now I'm getting new references to Shakespeare and like little jokes that maybe I missed before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you've not seen it but you're listening in, the basic setup is Vincent Price plays a Shakespearean actor who was believed dead.
Edward Lionheart.
Yes.
And actually on his grave, on his tombstone, it's even longer than that. It's like he's got a couple of middle names. I wish I'd written them down, but it's like Edward Lionheart basically.
And he's been believed to have been dead, and then the critics who he basically starts, he returns from the grave, not supernaturally. He just never really died, and he's enlisted the aid of his what I think say honestly beautiful daughter, Diana Rigg.
Yeah. It's weird because another thing about this film is the first time you watched it. So we're going to spoil the hell out of this.
Yeah.
The first time you watch it, obviously Diana Rigg is helping him because she's there. I mean, she basically like acts as bait to get one of the guys to the theatre to get killed. So she's obviously in on it. But also, one of Vincent Price's kind of right-hand man is like this kind of hippie guy. And then, of course, the big reveal at the end is that was Diana Rigg as well.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, it's so obvious when you watch it now, but, like, the first time you watch this, I feel like everybody's blown away by that. And it kind of does work, you know, even though when he's out of shot, it's her voice, like Diana Rigg's female voice.
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious, really, but it's still a twist.
Yeah, I don't remember the first time I watched it if I tumbled to that actually being Diana Rigg, but definitely knew there was something weird going on with that character because he never turns around and like has a conversation with him and says like,
yeah,
hey Steve, you know, go do whatever, you know.
Yeah,
it's he's just around all the time.
Yeah,
the way it's handled,
and he seems to be organising everybody, herding all the drunkards.
Yeah, and so there's this whole really wild thing that's just part of why the police can't figure out how he's doing anything. It starts with an Ides of March recreation.
Yeah.
Of him.
Julius Caesar.
Sorry, yes, the play is not called Ides of March. Yes, we should say the name of the play.
Yeah. You're right, though. It happens on the 15th of March. Yeah.
So, yeah, and he sets it up to kind of start on the 15th of March of... but he's enlisted all of these... people experiencing homelessness. Yes, it's a bunch of like crazy winos from down near the river.
Meth drinkers. I believe it says in the credits, the meth drinkers.
Yeah, and I actually had questions if you knew what the hell they were talking about. Like what? Because they're drinking some crazy purple drinks.
So methylated spirit is like something that's kind of famous in England. You kind of do everything with it, from clean stuff to put it in engines.
Oh God.
So I guess like the closest over here is white spirit you get in America, but it's like almost like a cleaning solution, I guess. But then also, I believe you can actually put it in like, you know, small engines to kind of run stuff. Or I used to have like a little steam engine, like a handmade, you know, way before even Lego. It was actually my dad's from when he was a kid. So I guess it comes from like the 1940s. But it was like Meccano was this thing that used to exist where you actually kind of built a small steam engine yourself as a kid with like a screwdriver, and it was all metal and all slotted together and loads of screws, and then you could put like this spirit in it and actually run it, start it up.
Oh wow. And
watch this engine run, which, you know, I'm sure some children died from these exploding.
Sure.
Back in the day. But yeah, these winos happily drink this, and I love the fact that one of the critics goes to a wine tasting. And so all these homeless people are dressed up, trying to act like posh. And then slowly you see like some of them actually just started drinking meths in the background. It's almost like they go, we don't like good quality wine. We prefer our own.
I'm not getting there with this stuff, yeah. So yeah, it's got this... And so, yeah, if it's been a while since you've seen it, they kind of go through then his last season of Shakespeare and all the plays he did and murders either that occurred during it or kind of inspired by activities within those plays.
I've literally written them all down. So we've got think it's a little bit like The Grandfather to like Seven, I guess, if you think of the movie Seven. So and around this time Vincent Price was actually doing Dr. Phibes as well, which is kind of similar, because I think that's based on the Egyptian curses. And so people died in that who kind of pissed him off by locusts or sandstorm or scorpions or whatever. But in this we have I don't know how many critics, about 10 of them I guess, but we have George Maxwell is stabbed on the Ides of March, which is Julius Caesar. Hector Snipe is run through with a spear and then dragged by a horse from Troilus and Cressida. Horace Sprout has his head cut off from Cymbeline. Trevor Dickman, the aptly named Trevor Dickman. Actually, so this is a rewrite by Lionheart. She has his heart cut out from The Merchant of Venice. That's not supposed to happen, obviously. Oliver Larding is drowned in a vat of wine from Richard III. Maisie Saltrey, who's actually the wife of that critic, is smothered by her husband, which is Othello. Which, to be honest, I think is a bit of a plot hole, because, like, how did he know he was going to do that? He could have forgiven her. Chloe Moon is burnt as Joan of Arc in Henry VI. And Meredith Merridew has to eat his own dogs, his babies, as Titus Andronicus. And then I guess, like, at the end, Lionheart does King Lear when he dies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also a bit of Hamlet when he does the fencing with Peregrine, but he doesn't kill him.
Yeah, it's and that's a wild scene.
Yeah, on the trampolines.
It's an interesting era because Vincent Price and other people at this point were kind of getting recruited to go over to England or over to Europe to go do horror films.
Yeah.
Vincent Price was still very much kind of in the mix in pop culture in the US, but kind of in a
So more TV, was it?
Yeah, I mean, but like Johnny Carson and stuff. I mean, it's kind of this weird window we have.
I imagine him turning up as a villain on Columbo over here and stuff like that.
I'm absolutely sure that's what happened, and it's this kind of weird hole we have in kind of the American memory of all of these people who'd been kind of sex symbols in like the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
In the 60s and 70s and even into the early 80s and into Murder, She Wrote and stuff like that, kept acting, but it all moved to TV, and a lot of it went to like TV specials and things like that, which we don't preserve, and we don't, people don't really review. So you think like these people kind of stopped doing but Vincent Price, when I was a kid, was at this point a voice. He was playing himself or playing a wizard named Vincent on Scooby-Doo. That's how I knew as a child who Vincent Price was. They did, I think it was called The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, and it was like Shaggy and Scoob and Scrappy and none of the rest of the cast, and then Vincent Price.
That's really weird.
Yeah, like driving around dealing with actual ghosts instead of like, people dressed up as monsters and stuff.
Well, he'd had a good run with the Edgar Allan Poe's, hadn't he?
Yeah. Kind of the Corman stuff, yeah.
And he was film-wise, horror film-wise, he was still quite a big hitter at the start of the 70s when this came out. But it's interesting because, like, this was a time where the British film industry was falling apart. It was just dying. Hammer was dying, Hammer Horrors. Everything was running out of steam and not getting funding. So we were kind of importing big American stars to try to get that money. And I guess in America, the stars who had aged out, like Kirk Douglas or Gregory Peck, were kind of doing horror because that's probably all they were getting offered. And that's why you start getting films like The Omen.
Yeah.
And, and Saturn 3 with Kirk Douglas and just really weird stuff.
Well, and I think that had started a little bit with, they call them the Hag films, but you couldn't have imagined two bigger stars in the U.S. than Bette Davis and Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're doing
Baby Jane,
and then Bette Davis went on to go do
Anniversary,
right, and Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, and all these things, and and poor Crawford ends up in like Trog and just says, you know what, I'm out. And we don't talk about Joan Crawford films much on the podcast, but I have a deep affection for Joan Crawford. So you just watch these things, you're like, oh my god. But fortunately, by the time I think they got brought over to Britain, which I think had Crawford been 10 years younger, she might have been part of that wave.
Yeah.
The quality of the stuff's at least imaginative. You're not doing Trog, right? It's closer to Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte.
It's a bit classier, a little bit classier.
Yeah, yeah. And this one's great. I mean, Vincent Price at this point, I mean, he might have been, popular, among a certain crowd, but he had never gotten good notices.
No. Well, we have to be careful because what I love about this movie is it's not saying he's a bad actor.
No.
I think that's a misreading of this. It's like
yeah.
It's actually saying he's just stuck in a rut and he'll only do Shakespeare. And what I love is the fact that it kind of plays on Vincent Price himself, because Vincent Price always wanted to do Shakespeare, and they wouldn't let him because they said, "No, you're the horror guy."
Yeah.
So this is almost like his revenge on... It's like very meta. It's almost like his revenge on all the critics since the 1940s who said, "No, you're the horror guy.
Yeah.
You can't do Shakespeare." And I think it's unsurprising that this is his favourite film, and this was Diana Rigg's favourite film that they made. And weirdly, years later, I can't believe I missed this because I still lived in England, but I think in the early 2000s, Jim Broadbent did a theatrical version of this in London, just for like a couple of months, and I totally missed it, and I'm still kicking myself about that. But in that, I think a big misstep, because I read reviews, of course, and I read as much as I could about it. I even bought the script of it, which is a bit different to the script for the film. So with that, I think a big misstep they made was they still set in the 1970s. The only set was the disused theatre, and they cut out a couple of the deaths that included the wives, but they kept everything else. I think they changed the critics to newspaper critics, like English newspaper critics. But the big misstep that they made with it was Jim Broadbent played him as a bad actor. And I'm like, you're kind of missing the point of it if you do that. I mean, it might still be okay, but he's not a bad actor. That's the point. He just wants to do Shakespeare.
Yeah, they say basically they were trying to force him into joining the 20th century. Like and I don't know. Also, he seems very fixed on doing kind of very classical versions of Shakespeare at that. Yeah, totally. And
although at the end, weirdly, he goes, "Well, what do you think of my interpretations? This is your dish with Meredith Meredith. Look what I've done to all these. I've made all these like very original Shakespearean adaptations." So I guess both ways a little bit.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and you're right. I mean, Price had curiously started as, he was this good-looking guy who was like 6'4". I mean, if you watch movies, he's in Laura, and he's in some other noir. He's in His Kind of Woman with Mitchum and Jane Russell, and he always plays kind of a cowardly, foppish playboy who's he's been able to kind of parlay his charm and good looks into whatever he's currently doing. Yeah. And he actually plays a not very good actor in His Kind of Woman, who's like, he shows his own film at this like resort they're at, and he's like sitting there like delighted, like looking at everybody else like while they're watching the film. But yeah, and at some point, he made this pivot into horror that with his voice and presence, really worked for him. But yeah, he absolutely ended up getting pigeonholed. Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is his like late night career of like showing up on Carson and stuff. Yeah, I mean, he did that. He was just such a presence that he showed. And he also had his crazy thing where he like figured out how to cook fish in a dishwasher.
I was about to say, didn't he do cooking a lot?
Yeah, he did a lot of cooking stuff. Yeah, he's a gourmet chef. And
that's why in this I love like the scenes where he's just beating the eggs. Yeah, and there's just so many little. I mean, it's so good at like funneling and channeling so much of Price into the character, but without demeaning him. It's like, even I think one of the critics, he's reading the review and he goes, so, you thought it was the rantings of an aging mess in the Idol? And kind of rolls his eyes, and it's like, that's almost like talking about himself.
My favorite criticism that he reads out loud is they talk about the two beautiful lily white women, and it says, and it gives you the presence of a ham sandwich.
Yeah, kind of like stuck between the two young kind of female leads. Yeah, he looks like a ham sandwich. Yeah, it's just so. I mean, I think it's like an example of an excellent script. It's a really good script, and although I think the last third is possibly the weakest because it's kind of running towards the finishing post a little bit. Really, and there's a couple of bits you can kind of like tut about. I mean, one of them is like, I think with Sprout, Arthur Lowe's Horace Sprout. I still, after his death, because basically they cut his head off. The maid comes in the morning, screams, faints. His wife wakes up, screams. And then we cut to like Devlin, who's the chairman of the critics, just coming out of his flat to get his papers in the morning. And Horace Sprout's head is on his milk bottle. And I'm like, now, like, how did they get his head from there to there?
Yeah.
Is Vincent Price still lurking around? Did he grab it again? Doesn't really make any sense. But you can kind of let those couple of things go.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because I think it just moves so fast. And it's so well done. You know? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we do some basic study of Shakespeare, in the U.S. and in high school, maybe a little bit of Romeo and Juliet or something, Midsummer Night's Dream in middle school. But there's not a huge focus. So for me, a lot of the plays are things I have not seen. But the nice thing is if you're just kind of through culturally osmosis, you know what they're basically talking about. Yeah. I've seen Richard III as a movie, those sorts of things.
But also watching this, I was thinking it really balances horror and comedy and pathos, because there's a couple of scenes where Price actually, and he's not joking, he does mean to kill himself. And you have the flashback of him like basically walking on the balcony doing the soliloquy just before he throws himself off. And
that's a great scene.
That's a great scene. It's so good. And how even the critics go from like ridiculing him to slowly going, oh shit, this is actually kind of getting out of hand. And then the final scene where he's holding, supposedly holding, I'm sure it's a dummy, Diana Rigg. And like just saying, you shouldn't have brought me out of the grave. I think those are incredibly touching. But then you also have like very funny scenes. You also have horrific scenes. I mean, what I love about the deaths is, unlike a slasher movie or Friday the 13th or whatever, it's not just a knife going through her head. I think every critic, especially like after the first couple, have enough time to realise what's going on, and it kind of dawns on them that like, oh my god, I'm about to get murdered. Yeah. And that's quite scary, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as far as like, sometimes we talk about, is this a good thing to put on for Halloween? I think this one's a good time any time of the year.
Yeah, totally.
It doesn't really rely on any particular flavor of creepiness or being part of this, that part of the year of the season. I think
maybe March the 15th you should start.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good springtime horror film. But yeah, it's got a great vibe to it, and for all of the reasons you just talked about, it really mixes in all of those things. And I always enjoy a good horror movie when you can have kind of a laugh along with the absolute nightmarish stuff you're seeing on screen. It helps alleviate some of the tension. And
it is Shakespearean. I mean, it's where it comes from, but it's kind of what it's channeling as well. The fact that Shakespeare could switch from one emotion to the other so easily.
Yeah. One of the things that's a little bit of trivia that I thought about while we were watching it that I hadn't thought about the first time is there was an American Shakespearean actor named Edwin Booth. And that's clearly where they took the name, but not the story in any way. But one of the funny things is that's also, he named his daughter Edwina, and that is the name of the daughter in this as well. But Edwin Booth is the brother of John Wilkes Booth, the guy who assassinated Lincoln.
That's crazy.
So there's this whole weird schism of like, Edwin Booth had to really disassociate himself then, obviously, from his brother. There's a statue of Edwin Booth in New York still.
Oh, wow.
Of, like, when he passed, they were like, he was such a great actor, we have to memorialize him.
But just don't mention his brother.
Yeah, let's not talk about his brother.
The black sheep.
Yeah. Well, apparently Edwin was the only one in the family with the... I'm trying to remember, this is something I read, 10, 15 years ago, but I believe he was the only one in the family with northern sympathies. Everyone else had southern sympathy. So he was... Edwin was the black sheep of the family, but nationally, obviously, felt a little differently, so...
Yeah. Well, this was, I mean... Just looking at the cast of this, because I didn't read out the cast. Normally I read out the cast at the start of these. but it's just so big. And a lot of these guys, like I say, so Vincent Price was the American import, but you have Diana Rigg, who obviously had done a lot of Shakespeare on stage at this point. That's how she kind of got to this position. Ian Hendry, the same. He'd been in the British TV show The Avengers, and was kind of almost like level pegging with Michael Caine for a while. And then he kind of like, I think his career went downhill a bit in the 70s after this. He still became very popular, but I think he was like a big drinker, and that kind of curtailed him a bit. But you said, the first thing you said, I think, when you saw Harry Andrews, was like...
that guy's on the Kryptonian Council.
Yeah, it's like you got all these old actors who turned up in like films, like later big blockbusters. Michael Hordern from Where Eagles Dare, and the voice of Paddington. Jack Hawkins, of course, who's been in like a million war movies. And a really weird mix of very famous people on British TV, like Arthur Lowe was in Dad's Army, which is a show that ran for like about 15 years in England about the Home Guard. So the guys who were too old to go to war in the Second World War, who kind of stayed and were like, well, we have to camouflage our cars and not do all this kind of crazy stuff. They were played for comedy. And Eric Sykes was a big kind of like TV fixture in the 70s as a comedian. He played Inspector Dog, Sergeant Dog. And he's very meta in this as well, because, he's basically kind of almost looking at the camera and just, kind of grinning when he's told information. And like he says at one point, so when's the next murder, sir? Next intended murder, Sergeant. And Joan Hickson, who played Sprout's wife, went on to be a Miss Marple on TV. Madeline Smith, the secretary, you might recognise from Live and Let Die, the star Live and Let Die.
I couldn't place her, but that's who that was. Okay. Yeah. It was driving me bonkers when we were watching the film.
Yeah. And Cole Brown, I think, I'm not sure. Cole Brown may be American as well, I'm not sure. But a nice story about that was, I think Vincent Price was in the throes of separation or divorce from his wife, and Diana Rigg introduced him to Cole Brown, and they ended up getting married later and spending the rest of their life together.
Now, Cole Brown was which character?
Cole Brown was Miss Moon, who got electrocuted.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
She looked familiar, and I couldn't place why, and I'm betting it's just because I've seen photos of her with Vincent Price.
Yeah. It was a lovely kind of... Because I think, Vincent Price was obviously not having a happy time romantically with his wife, and then, Diana Rigg, I think, introduced them without realising he was actually married. And they hit it off. And then, of course, later on they got married and spent the rest of their life together. So that's kind of great. It must have been a very happy kind of time for him to kind of be on the film as well. Yeah. Original name for it was Much Ado About Murder.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Often I'm like, it's good they got rid of that title, but that one I like.
Yeah. It might actually be better than Theatre of Blood, even though I'm used to Theatre of Blood. And the director, Douglas Hickok. So you asked me an interesting question about the old theatre they used in this, which they call the Burbridge Theatre in the film, but it was actually the Putney Hippodrome from 1906, which was demolished, I think, a year after this movie. But it also features in Sitting Target, an Oliver Reed thriller, which the same director made a couple of years before this. So he must have really liked this theatre, the ambience of it.
Well, the reason I asked about it was they clearly actually set it on fire.
A lot of damage.
Yeah, and I was like, because I'd kind of forgotten. I knew it got set on fire, but my memory was you saw the fire outside when he's going up the outside of the building.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten that you saw that much flame inside the building, and I was like, this building doesn't recover from this. You can't have those velvet curtains and have flame and smoke next to them. And then you were like, well, they demolished it. I was like, that
because it wasn't controlled. But I mean, obviously it was controlled to a certain extent because you got actors running around. But it wasn't like, that thin line of fire. Right. It was like stuff really going.
Yeah. They've been given the okay to go ahead and just burn because they throw a torch up into the box seat.
Yeah.
And it just blows up. And I was like, Jesus, I guess they really did that. Because I had a flash of a thought of, well, so when they filmed Phantom of the Opera in the 1920s.
Yeah.
the Universal basically hung on to that, and almost anything in the U.S. that they filmed in an opera house, that was what you saw.
You kept seeing the same
for
thing.
like 70 years or whatever, until they finally tore that set down and it was a big to do when they did that.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I think that's actually because it looked, the whole film was kind of shot on I'm using air quotes, on location.
Yeah.
And I was like, England 1970s, they definitely would have had theaters around that they were ready to retire out. It's kind of before, like in the US, that's about when the preservation effort started.
Well, a lot of English theatres were turned into cinemas, and of course, by the start of the 70s, films aren't doing so good. So a lot of those cinemas are starting to close. So you could probably redress a cinema as a theatre back to how it looked as a theatre pretty easily as well.
Oh yeah. You just have to make sure you covered where the projector was and take the screen down.
Yeah.
I mean, the Paramount here in Austin itself was built as a theater for live performances, and it's a place Simon and I go to watch classic film. And it in the 70s went through a very similar thing. Like if you see like street footage of Congress Avenue where it sits, it's like they're showing like Bruce Lee movies and stuff. It was basically a second run theater for a good decade. Right. And it was in the late 70s, early 80s when they started doing the preservation. So when I moved to Austin in 84, it was back to being the Grand Dame Theater of Austin. But I'd missed, a decade prior, it would have been like, I'm going to go,
slightly seedy kind of.
Yeah, go see a second run of Enter the Dragon or whatever. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. Well, I think that's why this feels quite fresh still compared to, because I love Hammer movies, you know that. But Hammer movies, quite often you laugh at the fact that it's the same old set, just slightly redressed.
I've seen many versions of Dracula's Castle at this point.
I mean, Hammer were quite, they weren't embarrassed about it. They would literally go shoot a double feature and go, we'll do a Dracula and we'll do the Reptile, and it's almost the same villagers running around the same sets, just like with a different problem. So the fact that this does shoot outside, and that first scene with George Maxwell where he's killed in the old warehouse. That's very creepy, I think. That's very creepy. These disused, rundown buildings with, kind of like chain fences inside and all plastic kind of hanging down. Yeah, it kind of really gives it like a more threatening feel.
I agree. I mean, I like a good Hammer movie, and I categorize them as horror, but they're not often very scary. Yeah. It's more of just kind of watching a story play out, and I do think that especially that first murder,
it's nasty.
Yeah, it's because you really don't. I mean, the guy's so absurd. Who goes, they need an authority figure to.
Hello, stop that. Go get up now.
But when all those people start to turn on him, it's and that's kind of the crazy thing about the horror of this.
It's almost a little bit like our version of kind of Texas Chainsaw. A little bit. It's like that kind of like. Oh, this is what it would be like if it actually happened in real life. Yeah. And it wouldn't be like particularly well shot. It'd just be like nasty.
Yeah. And that's something to talk about too. Yeah. I mean, Hammer films are all, tripod, and managed lighting. And this
Christopher Lee, his contact lenses in.
God, poor guy. I can't see. I'll just amble forward. But the natural lighting and things, they use a lot of natural lighting, and then when they're in the theater, it's not obviously natural lighting, but it's very controlled, theatrical. Like it feels like the lighting that would actually be on the stage and from the Klieg lights and whatnot. So.
And I think they get away with a lot of stuff because when they are in the theatre, it's supposed to be theatrical. He's purposely doing that. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I have to give a big shout out for the music as well. Michael J. Lewis did this, and I kind of went out when I first saw this at college. When I saw it at college, I should say, you couldn't get the soundtrack, or if you could, maybe it was just on vinyl. But I couldn't find it. It is now out on CD and streaming. But I think I just bought like a best of Michael J. Lewis of all his films, and it had like 3 pieces from this. And he's done some great music for other movies as well, a lot of British movies. But This score is fantastic because he kind of uses almost like Elizabethan kind of instrumentation to give it like a very kind of like, you know, a lot of pathos and a lot of emotion. And but he also kind of like does a great Dr. Kildare spoof when they're cutting off Sprout's head.
Oh, I didn't pick up on that at all. Okay. Yeah, that's hilarious.
And then, you know, quite a good kind of action scene when, like, the guy's being dragged by the horse or when they're doing the fencing. And it's just like, it fits so well. It just fits really good. But yeah, like I say, I mean, I absolutely adore this film. I think it's fantastic. And, you know, and who hasn't had that kind of urge to do this to, you know, teachers or bosses? Yeah, that we've all had to suffer in the past. I think, you know, it definitely resonates a little bit with everybody.
The film does this thing, and I don't want to take it too seriously, but it does talk about kind of the impact of what critics do to people's livelihoods.
So I wrote down this time when we were watching it, this is almost like pre-internet commenting on the internet. Now, of course,
sure.
Now we have so many critics.
Yeah.
We would never be able to kill them. But it is like a kind of like a very early precursor for, I mean, you know, a lot of celebrities actually being run off the internet with all the toxicity.
Yeah. I think that's a good comparison. I mean, one of the things that, I mean, it is true if you know, a TV show, you know, they want to get the critics' approval. Everybody does, and critics have only so much power. I mean, shows stay on the air for years that the critics, you know, don't love. But you know, it is a person's opinion at the end of the day, or a critical, you know, look at something. And everyone, you know, if nothing else you get from the podcast, everyone comes at film differently, right? Or plays or narrative. And it is, you know, interesting. It was one of the things I hadn't really thought about a whole ton. And I remember reading a story about the TV show, American TV show Home Improvement.
Oh, yeah.
Where one of the leads, the wife on the show, I think her name is Patricia Richardson, that might be right, talked about how she wanted to get off the show. But the producers basically were like, if you leave the show, it's not a family thing anymore. And you've just put these 100 people out of work because no one will watch the show anymore. Everyone who works on the show, and that's just 100 people you see. That isn't all the people in the offices and everything else.
Which is what Hammer kept doing to Christopher Lee.
Right.
Which is why he did 7 Draculas. Because I think after the first couple, they kept saying to him, Chris, if you don't do it, we're like, people can't feed their children.
So it's someone who's not even related to the thing. It's this person who shows up for, you know, they talked, one of the critics had shown up in his review, talked about how he fell asleep and how he woke up refreshed and was saved from this terrible performance, which he hadn't even borne witness to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the play closes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all those people suddenly are out of work. And so it's...
Well, Vincent Price, with the fencing scene, he has that very impassioned, how do you know the sweat and tears and blood that goes into creating this? You just pull it down. Mm-hmm. You know, without a thought, just for a funny byline.
Right.
Yeah.
And that may be the flip side of this era we're in, is there's a niche for everything. I mean, there's stuff out there I think is absolute garbage. Like, I can't believe anybody watches it. And I'm not talking about reality TV. I'm talking about straight up narrative TV that's on networks. And it has its champions, and those shows run for years, and people talk about them in awe. And I'm just like, you know, but also it doesn't matter what the hell I think. Yeah. Because I'm just a dude who happens to have a site that gets about 100 clicks a post. So,
well, it's also, you know, the other side, I guess, is like, you know, as a celebrity or a star these days, or an actor, you can say something incredibly innocuous and you'll have a whole, you know, tidal wave of shit coming your way, which may drive you off Twitter or Facebook, you know, if you want to get away from it, because that's the only way, because there's no real kind of like way of controlling that anymore.
Yeah. There's probably a whole podcast about
I've just read like 3 different examples in the last week. I'm not going to bore you with them, but it's just like different actors saying things and people either misinterpreted it or massively overreacted in a negative way to it, and I can kind of see both sides. And it's funny, the people who normally react and went, how dare they, are kind of almost like being worse than what they're accusing the initial person of, and it's like, well, this is just escalating for no reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think, of course, I think there's a role for critics in for everything. It always helps to open the paper and read and say, yeah, I got a good review. Yeah, we'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
I don't have as many sources as I used to for that sort of thing.
Yeah. There's also kind of bias, though. I guess you have to take into account where the critic is coming from. And again, I don't want to mention names here, but there's certain people I read like going, well, they would say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll totally. Jamie had a subscription to Entertainment Weekly back in like the 90s, and there was a guy named Owen Gleiberman who was a writer for Entertainment Weekly, and you just knew if anything had any kind of fantastical elements or was particularly silly as a comedy. I mean, I remember he gave Kids in the Hall Bringing Candy an F, and I was like, I had just watched that movie and cried laughing through the whole thing. I was like, success!
Yeah.
And he's just like, this is silly and shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And I was just like, we're very different people, Owen Gleiberman, and I pretty much know at this point I can invert whatever grade you give something. I mean, he was giving...
Yeah.
I think it was Lord of the Rings was one of the ones he gave, like, a C or something like that. And you were just like, okay, it's just not for you.
Yeah.
And if you came into film because you thought everyone should be making movies like, at the time, Woody Allen or whatever.
Yeah.
I can understand being irritated. It's the same people now who kind of shake their fist at the heavens and say Marvel, and you're like, you know what? Marvel puts out 2 movies a year.
Yeah.
Marvel isn't stopping anybody from doing anything.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the difference between, rather than just going, this thing is worthless, you have to say, this thing isn't necessarily for me. Yeah. But I appreciate that a lot of people like it. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And people just don't stop and do that. They just go, it's rubbish.
Or they decide that they're like, I'm gonna show everybody, and I'm gonna write the super negative review of this thing because of all this. Yeah. Of just all the, you're pent up there because everyone's now trying to make tentpole movies about, because we've seen the success of Marvel and people have tried to replicate that. It's like, be mad at the fact that the studios were all purchased by mega corporations who don't really understand how movies work. Don't be mad at the fact that, Marvel is doing things. So you've got to write the review that you think is going to nuke the whole Marvel thing, which is sometimes what I think people are doing. Yeah. Or they build up these frustrations, just as these critics in this movie, where he shouldn't be doing this. He needs to get with the 20th century and go do, I don't know, Ibsen, which is not 20th century. Like, I don't know what they wanted him to do. They wanted him to do experimental 70s theater. I mean... Well,
the play they seem to mention with this William Wallace, this younger actor, I'm guessing it's something like Entertaining Mr. Sloan, or something like that. Something very 60s or 70s, like you say. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of funny how most of the critics hide behind Devlin. And when Devlin, he does admit, we purposely humiliated him. We use the occasion to kind of ridicule him, this guy. But then he also kind of says, I think he shows enough remorse that we kind of get behind Ian Hendry's character a bit, in the fact that he says, like he says to Edwina, I just want to push him into this century. I wanted him to do other stuff and stretch. Yeah. And of course, it's way too late for that by that point. But
he has thrown himself off a building. Yeah.
He has thrown himself off a building. Yeah. And enlisted a bunch of homeless people to kill people in elaborate ways. But yeah, I mean, and it kind of reminds me a bit of Kevin Spacey in Seven, at the end of Seven, where he's like, we see a sin on every corner. We just ignore it. Only in this kind of screwed up world can we say this is normal. Yeah. He's just doing a more exaggerated version, extreme version of what he believes is all around anyway. And I think the same with Price here. He's just been pushed over the edge, and he's not coming back.
Yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about, tropes of noir, of horror. And one of them is you always have the characters getting picked off one by one.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a thing that happens in horror.
From the least interesting upwards.
Yeah. And I think that this one does it about, because it's a comedy in many, like a black comedy, and it does it, I think, in maybe some very entertaining ways, because
definitely.
Your protagonist in this one,
it's also using the ways of the governor, Shakespeare.
Yeah. So
that's a good place to start.
But your protagonist is the murderer in this.
Yeah, and also the protagonist is, I think, quite sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
When you watch this, you kind of want Price to get away with it, really, I think.
Yeah, they do nothing to really set up the critics as being in any way sympathetic. They're all set up as various flavors of blowhard.
Well, they also have wonderful traits. They are caricatures and stereotypes to a certain extent, but I think they're played by such good actors that they kind of expand that. So you have, the henpecked husband, the jealous husband, the kind of ladies' man, the drunk, and it's just it's really good how they kind of their weaknesses are exploited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you said, well, how did he know the guy was going to murder his wife? And it's like, well, how did Iago know Othello was going to murder? Now I've forgotten. Desdemona?
Yeah, Desdemona. Yeah.
Okay, man, high school brain cells still firing. So
A in English lit then.
But yeah, it's I think it's highly enjoyable. And I know this podcast will be found for a long time, because this movie's going to have fans.
Yeah.
As long as it keeps getting shown, people are going to want to, and so people will stumble across this. I guarantee you, there's going to be lots of hits from the UK.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, even when I first, well, maybe not when I first saw this, when I was 5, but when I saw this, probably from high school age, from my teens, I always remember thinking, why don't they show this at school? Because they used to make us watch, because
of the murders.
Well, that's very true, actually. That's very true. I was going to say, there's not really any sex or swearing, but there are quite nasty murders. There's too much camp. But it's like the wigs are too terrifying that Vincent Price wears. But because when I had to watch Shakespeare at school, it was I'm so old now. It was even before Ken Branagh, so it wasn't like Branagh was coming in with all these great films which he did through the 90s.
Zeffirelli, and that was
we had the old Romeo and Juliet from the 60s. Mm-hmm. We had. I do remember you say that, though. You say this is too violent. I do remember us being shown Polanski's Macbeth, which has rapes and probably as much more gore than this. So I'm like, if we can do that, show me Theatre Blood.
We had to have, I think I'm remembering this correctly. I have a person I can ask, because she sat next to me in that English class. I think we had to have sign off to watch Romeo and Juliet, because you see Romeo's butt and I think her nipple at some point.
There's definitely a nipple in there, I was going to say.
Yeah, and I think
I looked very hard for that at the time.
I'm sure I was very excited to see it, at 14 or 15. But yeah, so we did not. We were actually, before this, talking about movies teachers showed us for bizarre reasons. And I saw Terminator in a computing class.
Yeah,
but
I saw Life of Brian in religious education.
Yeah,
which is amazing to think of.
But I do think this would be a good one. I think I would have freaking loved this in high school,
and I think it would get kids more interested in Shakespeare. That want to go and read the original text, which is always good.
It's juicy stuff. There's a reason it's lasted 400 years, right?
Yeah, and it's got a great sense of humour. I think towards the end, Price definitely accelerates in his disguises, in their ridiculousness. But again, the end's in sight.
Shylock, is that the character?
Because Shylock is probably not politically correct now.
Well, Shylock's going to be Shylock, but I can only imagine
at least it doesn't black up. At least it doesn't black up as Othello.
Oh my god. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's the costuming in this. They clearly went to town and whatever. I mean, that was because they weren't having to build sets.
Yeah,
they were able to hire talent, and they were able to go to the whatever. Yeah. You know, where you
costumer.
Yeah, and just go crazy.
Yeah, and he looks great. He does look great in his different personas. Yeah. I mean, he was obviously having a field day and loving it, and I think everybody was. I mean, you can kind of tell everybody's having fun on this. And I love the little jokes that you kind of get on multiple watchers, like at the funeral for Michael Hordern. It's like just little bits like Hoisbat rubs his neck, and that's like a little bit of foreshadowing of him getting his head cut off later and stuff. They were threatening probably 20 years ago now a Jim Carrey remake of this, and while I love Jim Carrey, I am actually a Jim Carrey fan, and I imagine it would be somewhat like Lemony Snicket if he had to go with this. I think the big difference is I'd never want this because A, this is perfect, and B, I think Jim Carrey would get lost in the characters, whereas Vincent Price still shines through all of the characters in this, which I think is why it works. It's still always Vincent Price.
You know who I think would have a field day doing it now?
Who's that?
Brana.
Yeah, that's true.
I think he'd kill it doing this. I think he'd have so much fun doing this, but I mean, I'm sure he's seen the film, but yeah, he's too busy doing other things. But I think you could remake it and possibly freshen it up.
You'd have to do it almost like he's a film. Maybe do it in the land of film. So he's killing them in different film ways or something.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you should say that. I had a passing thought during this movie of this feels in a way like a 1970s Batman villain. And back then there was, because they'd always have like a theme.
Wasn't he Vincent Price? Was he Egghead?
Well, yes. Yeah, but in the comics back in the 70s, Batman would have villains who were like, had a theme. It was always like a theme. There was like the Calendar Man, and there was like...
Cheese Man.
Well, I mean, they would commit, like Catwoman, what her crimes are all cat related, and the Penguins were always like, if someone stole the ostrich diamond or whatever, they'd make up, it'd be like, it must be the Penguin because it's bird themed, whatever.
Yeah.
But they also had these other characters who just never broke big. Like there was a character called the Film Freak, and he actually murdered people based on famous films.
All right.
And it's like what this is missing is Batman putting the clues together to eventually figure out that it's Lionheart who is doing all of this, and that kind of was how Batman worked up through like the late 80s, early 90s in the comics.
Until the film. Did the film make it serious? And obviously,
people decided Batman. Yeah, I don't want to get into Batman on this podcast, but it so it kind of made me a little reminiscent of like, this would have been a great 4-issue Batman arc of him having to put together, who this villain was, who was doing the murders, because Batman used to be a detective. That's totally true. Lose that once you get to like the Zack Snyder films. There's no detecting going on in those.
Just shotguns.
But yeah, so that made me. It did have that passing thought. But yes, he also was Egghead.
Yeah.
Hilariously on Batman. So.
I can. Yeah. I mean, I'd like I said, I'd rather have nothing. I think because I don't trust Hollywood to do it well. But yeah, I think if you did do this, you'd have to probably take it away from the theatre and maybe have him, based in movies instead. And I'm kind of thinking a little bit like, do you remember the FX movies?
Oh yeah, those are Brian Brown.
I'm kind of thinking something a little bit like that as well. Yeah, maybe using special effects and stuff. But I'm very happy to keep watching this. This is one of those films that stays fresh for me. But like the Italian Job, but like some other films, you obviously see it dating, but it doesn't make it stale.
Yeah, there's nothing in this aside from there's nothing stale. There's just things that are dated. Yeah, the conversation Diana Rigg has with the critic when she's duping him into coming to her was the time I was like, this is an era where even the telephone wasn't super reliable as a way. Like, he physically, like, they're like, how do we write this so we can show the conversation?
Yeah.
And it's like, he comes to this film set she's working on.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, I totally recommend this 110%. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. Music's amazing as well. I think it's the kind of crown jewel in the Vincent Price crown, and he's obviously done a lot of great films, but this was his favourite, and it's mine too.
I really enjoy it. I'm glad you brought it to me. At some point, I'm going to make you watch House of Wax, but
yeah, House of Wax is good.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much, and we will be back soon.
Thanks. Bye.
That about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.